Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Vibe podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Paul Anderson. And today we're going to be talking about the Gospel of John and its relationship to the Synoptic Gospels. So, Paul, thank you for joining me today.
You bet. Good to be with you, Jacob.
As a reminder, the links to purchase Paul's books will be in the description below and will also be in the pinned comment. As we've discussed in previous episodes, that there are overlaps with the Synoptic Gospels, some with John, not a lot, but you talk about the influence and counterfluence that's going on between them. That's kind of a little recap. Could you explain what you mean by that? Are they, in a sense, influencing each other, and it's not simply just it's not just one direction. It's multiple directions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jacob. One, I suppose, challenge that we have is all we have are biblical texts, and those are probably finalized, or at least the earliest texts that we have tend to be second or third or fourth century. A finalized text would be more fourth century and then later. And so all we have are texts, but we have similarities and differences. And so scholars make guesses about how to account for those similarities and differences. So if you look at the Gospel of John, it's the only gospel that claims to be written by an eyewitness or firsthand memory of Jesus. The traditional view of Mark is that it reflects John Mark. Now, he's from Egypt, Alexandria, not a follower of Jesus, at least, according to traditional view, and I think that's correct. But the tradition is that John Mark heard Peter preach in Rome, and that he finalized or that he collected Peter's preaching into a gospel order. Now, you can imagine that if Peter is coming to the end of his life, that Christ hasn't come back again, or the kingdom hasn't been fulfilled. You have people being killed by Nero, especially from 64 to 68 AD. And so you have an interest in preserving the preaching of the apostles. So scholars make a guess that the Gospel of Mark is probably the first gospel to be finalized. I think that's a correct view, maybe between 67 and 70 AD, if Peter dies around 65 or something like that. So you have Matthew and Luke that are building upon Mark. Matthew's is the closest. About 90% of Mark is included pretty much word for word in Matthew. So Matthew is using the Gospel of Mark as a text and then expanding upon it. Now, Luke, about 60% of Mark is included in Luke. So Luke also uses Mark as a text. A fact is that between Matthew and Luke, you have about 230 verses that are pretty much word for word similar. So that suggests a literary connection. Scholars have guessed for the last century and a half or so that maybe this is a Q document, or the German word is Quelle for source or fountain. So if there was a document of sayings, now, it doesn't include trial material, passion narrative, resurrection material, but a lot of sayings of Jesus and a few of his works and his deeds. So scholars have guessed that maybe this is an early document, and the only evidence that we have is that we have overlapping between Matthew and Luke of stuff that's not in Mark. Okay. Now, another possibility for that, and I apologize for backing up a little bit before we get to John. But another possibility that's been furthered recently in the last 20 years or so by Mark Goodacre of Duke and by some others. What if Luke has access to Matthew as well as Mark? Well, that would account for the similarities, and it would also account for the fact that between Matthew and Mark and Luke, where you have triple tradition, in over 100 cases, we have a word or a phrase that is common, that is added to Mark between Matthew and Luke. So we'll call these minor agreements, but the Q hypothesis, if Q does not include Mark, cannot account for the minor agreements. So that makes it more critically plausible to infer that maybe Luke has access to Matthew. Or my friend now in Cambridge in retirement, Richard Bauckham, he pushes it the other way. What if Matthew has access to Luke? Uh, I'm happy to go with Goodacre's approach to the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis. Luke might have access to Matthew as well as Mark. So these are connections between Matthew, Mark, and Luke that contribute to what we call the synoptic hypothesis. Now, synoptic means similar perspective, but that perspective is that Matthew and Luke are using Mark. Then again, the material that's distinctive to Matthew, material distinctive to Luke, it also coheres with the material in Mark and also in Q, if there was a Q. So, in other words, Jesus teaches in parables about the kingdom of God. You have similar signs that are performed. And so the material in M and L, or in Matthew and Luke, distinctive, that provides a coherent understanding or perspective on Jesus that is similar to the material in Mark. So that's what we call a synoptic perspective on Jesus. Now, here's a problem with John. John has some of the big chunks in my book, my second book on John. So my first book on John was on John's Christology. And in that book, I tested evidence by Rudolf Bultmann of different sources underlying and overlaying John. Bultmann thought maybe John is different because John is using a signs source, a Sameas source, kind of a Jewish apologetic tract. And then maybe it's got Gnostic sayings, and that would account for the I am sayings, maybe the Christ hymn at the beginning, maybe a passion narrative, which explains how John's later material is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the evangelists' writings, a few other sources, and then the redactor comes, and Bultmann thinks the redactor adds some of his own material to the Gospel of John. So a pretty complex theory of composition. And in looking at the theological tensions in John, Bultmann used this overall diachronic theory of multiple sources to explain, first, why John is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Answer, different sources. Now, he's also basing that on the inference that John cannot have been written by an eyewitness. He assumes, therefore, that an 1888 essay by Karl de Boer of Netherlands, written in German, that John the Apostle died early, but there's no evidence of that. In fact, the sources that they cite actually say that John the Apostle died in Ephesus after Domitian. And so the idea that John the Apostle died early is totally bogus. The evidence is totally against that. And yes, that's one of the reasons why Bultmann and other scholars say we know that John cannot be written by an eyewitness because John the disciple died early. Well, and I'm getting off track here, but you can see how this relates. Martin Hengel and Richard Bauckham and some others say, oh, well, maybe it's a confusion of John's. Maybe it's John the Elder, author of the epistles, the author of 2nd John and 3rd John, calls himself the elder, the presbyter. And Eusebius says that John the Elder is the disciple, or the presbyter is the disciple of John the Apostle, and they are both buried in Ephesus to this day. They are sleeping in Ephesus. And if you go to Ephesus and look at the huge church of the Church of St. John, you'll see that there are 4 graves underneath the altar place. And scholars or archaeologists might guess that these go back to at least John the Apostle and John the Presbyter, and maybe a couple of other people as well. Who knows? But anyway, the one of the reasons for saying that John cannot be written by an eyewitness is the inference that he died early. But George Hamartolos, 9th century, and Philip Sidetes, 5th century, they say James and John suffered martyrdom by the Jews, but they don't say that John died early. In fact, they both say John died after Domitian, who died in 96. And so maybe around 98 or 100 or so, which is also the traditional view that Eusebius mentions. Well, when I looked for evidence underlying Bultmann's highly diachronic theory, I tested all of his stylistic, contextual, and theological evidence in John 6 and found the distribution was random. So there's no evidence for alien sources underlying John, and also the view of Robert Fortna that maybe we have a signs gospel, like the Passion narrative and the miracles, and then the evangelists theologize the stuff. There's no evidence for that either. So that leads us then to ask, did John use the synoptics? Now, one way that some scholars, especially in Belgium at University of Leuven, and also C.K. Barrett, a great New Testament, especially Johannine scholar at University of Durham, until he retired, passed away a few years ago. One of the ways they explain John being different from the synoptics is to say, well, maybe John used the synoptics. Or how about this? In pushing back against Bultmann, they argued that John used Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they went back to two sources to ground that perspective. And Jacob, I'm giving you the history of scholarship. There are hundreds of essays written on this and several big books. I'm just giving you a huge overview of what scholars have thought and a strength-weakness analysis kind of in summary. So Barrett, though, and the Leuven School argued that John is dependent on the synoptics, and that's a way of disagreeing with Bultmann. Bultmann is wrong. John did not use sources. Author of John did not use alien sources. Maybe use the synoptics. Now, they're both assuming that it can't be written by an eyewitness, okay, or by firsthand memory. And so John must be dependent on something. Hey, we've got the synoptics. Therefore, John must have used the synoptics. Now, here's the critical flaw, though. In order to, as a basis for that, they go back to B.H. Streeter, who wrote a book on the four Gospels in 1924, a century and a year ago. And Streeter argued that John the Apostle died early, based on De Boer's thesis. And so B.H. Streeter actually is the source of the synoptic hypothesis, and also he really put into clear perspective the Q hypothesis. But when it comes to John, he said the one thing we know is that there's nothing historical in John. John is not in the category, in the genre of history. John is mystical devotionalism, like his mind is in the stars, and there's nothing historical in John. It's just a theologized flourish, and therefore John's historical material is based, first of all, upon his use of Mark and a theologization of Mark, and then maybe also he used Luke also. Now, Streeter also based his book on the 1910, 1909 volume by Bacon at Yale. Now, Bacon at Yale is also building on that 1888 essay by De Boer. But the problem is that both Bacon and Streeter, in basing their inferences on how John's material must have come together, are both basing their entire book projects on a total flaw. There's no evidence that John died early. And so based upon that, really, I'm calling it an embarrassment to critical scholarship, because De Boer himself and Bacon and Streeter and C.K. Barrett, who was absolutely brilliant, did not really look up the 5th century and the 9th century texts of Philip and George. And they both say John the Apostle died late, not early. So that tradition of James and John suffered martyrdom at the hand of the Jews, it actually is coming from the Syrian martyrology, where their deaths are celebrated on the same day in the church. This goes back to Mark chapter 10, where Jesus asks James and John, "Are you willing to be baptized by baptism and to drink my cup?" They say, "We are, therefore you shall be." And so their martyrologies are celebrated on the same day in the church calendar, but no one ever argued or believed that John the Apostle died early, until 1888, and then also a book by Schwartz in German a couple of decades later argued for the early death of John in German. So, Jacob, based upon those kinds of inferences, some scholars have said that John is dependent on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but especially Mark, or at least John knew Mark. On the other hand, some of the more serious scholars who have looked at the particulars, I'll include C.H. Dodd, I'll include Percival Gardner Smith, 1938, John and the Synoptics. Gardner Smith points out that every time John connects with the Synoptics is totally different. So if John knew the Synoptics, then he disagrees with the Synoptics at every single turn. Therefore, Gardner Smith says, John must not have known Mark or the Synoptics. Otherwise, he's just disagreeing with the stuff. And so it's easier to assume that John did not know the Synoptics. Well, if you have some familiarity, what if you have a more nuanced perspective? What if John is different because John is providing a different perspective? Or how about this? What if John knows at least Mark and therefore is augmenting Mark? And then maybe we have, or what if, so you mentioned the word interfluentiality. What if Mark knows some of John's material? Can I give you, for instance, in John 2:19, Jesus says, tear down this temple, I'll build it up in 3 days. Okay? He doesn't say that in Mark's temple cleansing or in Matthew's or Luke's temple cleansing. However, in Mark chapter 14, at the trial of Jesus, somebody cites at the trial, Jesus said, tear down this temple, I'll build it up in 3 days. He's quoting the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of Mark, it's found nowhere else except for the Gospel of John. And then on the cross, you have deriders saying to Jesus, hey, you who said you'd build the temple up in 3 days, pull yourself down from the cross. And so here are two cases where people in the Gospel of Mark, two different groups of people, are both quoting the Gospel of John. So I'm saying, wait a minute. If we have some kind of intertraditional connection, you cannot argue that it goes only in one direction. What if John's material also is used by Mark? Anyway, that's just some of it. What particular questions do you want to take from here, Jacob?
Well, before I get back to my questions, I'm going to take a couple of super chats real quick. I Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. Early fathers merged Clopas and Alpheus. Thoughts?
I have no idea about that. Does somebody else want to talk about that?
Well, I'll go ahead and go to the next super chat then.
Okay.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. If stories of Mark are muffled oral memory, then did John the Elder commission the first written edition to script anonymous Mark?
Okay, so John the Elder, I'm arguing John the Elder is the author of all three epistles of John. So the author of 2nd John and 3rd John calls himself the Elder. The author of 1st John doesn't mention his name. It's probably a circular. What I'm guessing, though, is that we have a first edition of John. I'm calling that the second gospel. Now, it's not circulated yet. We have no evidence of it. But the reason we might make this guess is that chapter 21 seems like it's added to chapter 20. Chapter 20 seems like it closes the narrative. Jesus did many other things, not written in the Prison of Disciples, not written in this book. I know Mark's out there. Stop bugging me for leaving it out. But these things are written that you might believe Jesus Christ, Son of God, believe you have life in his name. It seems like that is the conclusion of the narrative. But then we have chapter 21 that seems to be added. So that seems like it's later material. I'm thinking, not just I, but some of us think that it's added by the author of the epistles after the death of the beloved disciple. So chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, I didn't write this. He did. He was the one who leaned against the breast of Jesus in John 13. He was the disciple Jesus really loved, more so than Peter. Thank you very much. Jesus never said he wouldn't die. He said, what is to you if he lives till I come again? So apparently the beloved disciple, whom the final editor says he's the author of this, he's the evangelist. The person who finalizes the gospel, I think, is John the Elder, finalized the work of the beloved disciple, probably around 100.
Can you tell us about the Johannine and Lucan traditions, the influence, interfluence, and resonance?
Yeah. So I'm going to argue that we have, between John and Mark, we might have some going back and forth. Or how about this? And now this is not this idea did not originate with me. This I read this first in Raymond Brown's commentary on John, and also in his new introduction to John that's gathered by Frank Maloney, who just passed away this week and down in Australia, a really great scholar as well. So Brown argues that we might, like, if two preachers are traveling in ministry together, like if Peter, who's the source of Mark, and someone like John, who is the source of John, if they're traveling in ministry together, like Acts chapters 3 to 8, well, maybe some of the buzzwords stick between their stories of Jesus. So there might be Brown calls it cross influences between preachers. That to me could account for some of the similarities between John and Mark, just in other words, coming out of intertraditional interfluence or cross influence between oral traditions, like preachers hearing each other's stories. Or if you hear something read from a written text, then you might pick up on it and it might make it into your own preaching as well. Now, that also accounts for non-identical similarities. And so when it's really identical, okay, probably text is involved. But another fact is that some details, okay, so Matthew and Luke, in their uses of Mark, they tend to leave out 80% of the details, roughly. They'll leave out names of people, names of places, they'll summarize things. So when you use a synoptic comparison contrast text like synopsis of the Gospels, you'll find that Luke and Matthew are about between 60 to 80% of Mark, about 20 to 40% shorter in their condensations of Mark. What they do is to leave out details. However, sometimes you have details between John and Mark that are not in Matthew and Luke, like the green grass, much grass at the feeding, 200 denarii, that's how much it's going to cost for the loaves. 300 denarii, that's how much the oil is going to be costing. So you have some of these details that are between John and Mark that are not picked up on by Matthew and Luke. So if Matthew and Luke leave out details, but John and Mark have some common details, then maybe that suggests connections not in a written text or written textual familiarity, but oral tradition interfluentiality or familiarity. Therefore, so if it's oral tradition contact, you can't say that John depended on Mark. What if Mark's source depended on John? Or what if Mark's preacher heard the beloved disciple or the evangelist tell his story? And so we just don't know that the influence went in one direction only. So that's one way of thinking about cross influence or interfluentiality. You have similar issues with, like, the Q tradition. You have some similarities between John and Q tradition, or Matthew if Luke is using Matthew, but on Luke and John. Okay, so what's really interesting is that Luke changes Mark's narrative 6 times in ways that cohere with John. This is a fact. How do you explain that? Now, again, Streeter and maybe Barrett and some of my friends, Mark Goodacre perhaps, and James Baker, they might say, well, John is depending on Mark, of course, or John is depending on Luke as well as Mark. Well, now wait a minute. If Luke is using Mark, how do you explain the fact that Luke departs from Mark and coincides with John? Let me give some instances. you have little details getting added, like the right ear is cut off, or Satan enters Judas, or on the Mount of Transfiguration, they beheld his glory, or even a more significant difference. Instead of a foot anointing, instead of a head anointing in Mark and Matthew, the woman anoints the feet of Jesus. That's only in John. And so Luke follows John in making it a foot anointing. Also, she wipes the feet of Jesus with her hair. That's a detail in John, but not in Mark. So I'm asking myself, where in the world did Luke get these details, given that they're only in John and not in Matthew or Mark? Some other facts. Luke has a great catch of fish, but he puts it early, the calling narrative in Luke chapter 5, instead of at the end. So I don't think Luke has a text of John because it's the great catch of fish, and also they're concerned the nets are going to break. So that kind of, similar anxiety. Luke also kind of embellishes it. So in John, Jesus says, cast your net onto the right side of the boat. Luke symbolizes it and says, cast your net into the deep. And so he kind of, makes it, sort of a moral or a spirituality kind of expansion. Here's another fact. Mark and Matthew have two feedings, feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, Mark 6 and Mark 8. I've just written a 17,000 word essay on John 6, Mark 6, and Mark 8. Luke has only one feeding. It's the feeding of the 5,000, like John. But you have the confession of Peter in Mark 6 and in Matthew 16 after the feeding of the 4,000. Okay? Well, Luke moves the confession of Peter to the other feeding, like it is in John, the feeding of the 5,000, not the feeding of the 4,000. So it seems to me that Luke is following John's lead against Mark and against Matthew in putting Peter's confession after the feeding of the 5,000, not the feeding of the 4,000. In a second way, Luke seems like he's conflating the confessions in Mark and in John. So he's harmonizing Mark and John. In Mark, Peter says, you are the Christ. In John, Holy One of God. In Luke, the Christ of God. So it seems to me that Luke is harmonizing John with Mark because he has at least some partial familiarity with some of John's material. Now, again, I don't know that it is he has a written text. Maybe he's hearing it performed among the churches. Maybe he has access to some of it. Here's another interesting fact: Luke does something really strange. He puts the anointing story early instead of late, and so he puts it in Luke chapter 7, perhaps in the context of Jesus is accused of being a party animal, dining with sinners and that kind of a thing, instead of at the very end. And then Luke adds a woman. Why is she grateful? Why is she doing this? Oh, maybe she is much sinful. And so the sinful woman, she's much grateful. And he adds a parable about the much sinful and much grateful woman. That's why she does this. And that's why she wipes the feet of Jesus with her hair. Now, what's really interesting is that Luke then adds in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, three women that are sponsoring Jesus. And one of these is Mary Magdalene. So now that's also the primary reason why some later scholars in the 5th and 6th centuries have said, oh, maybe Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, or maybe she was much sinful. Maybe Mary Magdalene is the woman who anointed the feet of Jesus in Luke chapter 7, because she's mentioned in Luke chapter 8, and she is much sinful and therefore much forgiven. Again, it doesn't say she's a prostitute, okay, even in Luke. But the text never says that Mary Magdalene herself, nowhere in the New Testament is Mary Magdalene presented as an unfaithful woman. So that develops as a conjecture later on because of Luke 8 and also Luke chapter 7. Just one more point here. What if Luke adds the name Mary Magdalene because he has heard the name Mary in an oral performance of John chapter 12? So Mary, sister of Lazarus, is grateful because Jesus has raised her brother from the dead, not because a woman is grateful to have her sins forgiven. Now, to me, that seems more realistic. It's less moralizing. That suggests greater historicity of John's narrative as opposed to the moralizing conjecture that Luke makes, which shows Jesus as being accused of being a party animal. So Jacob, that might suggest that Luke is hearing some of John. He hears the name Mary Magdalene, Mary, sister of Lazarus, and assumes it must be Mary Magdalene. Now, Luke also adds in chapter 10 of Luke, adds two sisters, Mary and Martha. But there again, he gives them domestic roles. Instead of showing them as being grateful for Jesus raising brother Lazarus from the dead, and Mary and Martha both say to Jesus in John 11, if you would have been here, our brother wouldn't have died. There's real grief in the Johannine narrative that is not present anywhere in the Synoptics. But if Luke has heard of Mary and Martha, and then Mary is anointing the feet of Jesus, and they're taking care of him in John chapter 11 and 12, then Luke puts their memories into domestic roles. Martha is doing the chores, thank you very much, but Mary shows the good example of having a relationship with Jesus, and yet we're still thankful that Martha does the chores. So again, these are ways that Luke domesticates the material that's in John, as opposed to going with, I think, a more grounded and perhaps even historical presentation in the Gospel of John.
When Luke states in the beginning of his gospel that he's using multiple sources and not just non-eyewitness accounts, but including eyewitness accounts, do you think this could be the case because Luke had contact with John's material?
Thanks, Jacob. And this is something that I've just included in a huge essay on John and Luke Acts. So authentic spirituality in John and Luke Acts. and I also mentioned it in appendix number 8 in my Christology of the Fourth Gospel, first published in 1996, third edition 2010. Luke 1:2, what I've received from eyewitnesses and servants of the Logos. Whoa, is Luke saying thank you, Mark and Q and Matthew and the Johannine tradition, by the way, for the stuff. Now, you can't prove that, but it really seems like he's echoing appreciation for the Johannine tradition as well as other sources that he's using. Can I just give one more, for instance? I'm doing my doctoral dissertation at Glasgow under John Riches, a great Bultmannian scholar. It was just a great experience. Did some research at Tübingen with Otto Betz and Martin Hengel. And so I'm just looking up everything. And of course, scholars saying, well, John is different from the Synoptics. John's Jesus speaks in I am sayings. He doesn't include parables. Doesn't include much about the kingdom of God. Has miracles in John that aren't in the Synoptics. He doesn't include exorcisms. It's got 3 Passovers instead of 1. He goes to and from Jerusalem. In the Synoptics, it's just 1 trip to Jerusalem. So there are huge reasons and good reasons why scholars question John's historicity. Also begins with the Christ hymn. Wait a minute, that's elevated. How could that be historical? Although 114, Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You do have emphases on the humanity of Jesus. Further, you have more emphases on the suffering and pathetic or pathos-filled presentation of Jesus. He weeps, he groans, he thirsts. So you have the most human Jesus in John as well as the most elevated. And this is a fact. And you have more archaeological details in John than all that the Gospels put together, canonical and non-canonical. So John has a lot of historical stuff and a lot of theological stuff, and that is a fact. And scholars are trying to figure these things out in terms of how that relates to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But so I'm just looking up everything and looking up Peter and James and John and everything, and stumbled upon Acts 4:19 and 20, where you have a composite statement Now, the fact that it's, I think, like two sentences by two different people as opposed to a chorus, I think that's why scholars haven't noticed this before. But Sean Adams of Glasgow later, after I was there, Sean Adams has shown that you have composite statements where more than one person are sometimes quoted in a quotation text. So here we have two sentences that are uttered by Peter and John, but the first one seems Petrine and the other seems Johannine. The first statement is this: we must obey God rather than man. Well, Peter says something similar in Acts 5:29 and 11:17. Okay, so Peter's presented saying, God versus humanity, and basic Platonic rhetoric associated with Peter and his power orientation. But the second statement is this: we cannot help but speak about what we have seen and heard. And as I read that, I'm going, my goodness, that sounds a lot like 1 John 1:3. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard from the beginning, what we have touched with our hands and seen with our eyes. My goodness, that presents the gospel, that presents John the Apostle, not John the Elder, as uttering a Johannine cliche. Now, it doesn't prove that John the Apostle wrote the Gospel of John or was the evangelist, but you can't say that the first connection was Irenaeus 100 years later. No, this is in the late first century. John the Apostle is presented as uttering a Johannine statement, and that's a fact. Also, Jesus in John 3:32, what I have seen and heard from my Father who is in heaven. And so, Jacob, that's one of the things that got me thinking about, oh my goodness, Luke here is presenting, not for any rhetorical reasons here, is presenting John the Apostle as speaking a Johannine characteristic utterance. And that's literary fact. It's not my fault. I only read it. Okay, and so anyway, I mean, maybe the critics have played us false here, or maybe they've said, okay, yeah, John's really different. Therefore, we know. How about this? Therefore, we know that there were never two histories of Jesus that were different. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's a coherent history. John is different, therefore it can't be historical. It can't be written by an eyewitness. What? Is that good historiography? I mean, how about Hayden White and metahistory? Whose history are we talking about? What if we have different perspectives? What if we have apostles disagreeing with each other? Bonehead over there never got it right. Yeah, no, these guys are mama's boys. And so both in Mark and in John, you have Jesus predicting the death of the other apostles. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts the deaths, the martyrdoms of James and John. They will drink the cup. They will be baptized with the baptism of Jesus. And in John, you have the prediction of Peter's death in John 21. How about this? They're also called nicknames. James and John are called Boanerges or Boanerges, sons of thunder, Mark 3:17. Okay, nicknames, but in John 1, Peter is called Cephas, Aramaic for Petros or rock. So Simon Cephas. So you have, nickname calling of the Zebedee boys and of Peter between John and Mark. Maybe we have two different apostolic perspectives here, and maybe Matthew and Luke build upon Mark. Maybe John builds around Mark and is different on purpose. So that leads into my overall synoptic theory, or my overall gospel theory, which I call a bioptic hypothesis. I'm arguing that from day one, John and Mark had two totally different perspectives, coming from two different traditions, or maybe even two different apostles, at least two different sources, first-hand sources or second-hand sources. From day one, Matthew and Luke builds upon Mark, John builds around Mark, and is different on purpose.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about Mark having contact with Johannine material.
Yeah.
You also just stated that John builds around Mark.
Yeah.
So did Mark have contact with the first edition of John, or or a version of John that predates the first edition? It was a draft. So in other words, what do you mean by Mark's contact with Johannine material?
That's a great question, and we have no evidence of an early edition of John. All we have evidence of is that later material seems to be added to to early material. That's the best guess that we can make. But as long sorry, as long as we're guessing, though, if you have the addition of chapter 21, well, how about maybe some other stuff like the Christ hymn? So when you look at the John the Baptist references in John chapter 1, there came a man from God, his name was John, not the light, a witness to the light, verses 6, 7, and 8. And then you have verse 15, he was before him, though he came after him. And then John 1, 19 to 42, where John the Baptist says, I'm not the Messiah, he is. Then I'm guessing, Jacob, that's the beginning of the first edition of John. And the first edition of John seems like it's echoing Mark chapter 1. And so in Mark chapter 1, you have John the Baptist who points to Jesus, and you have the temptation narrative and that kind of thing. So it seemed like the first edition of John began with echoing Mark and kind of picking up where Mark is leaving off, but it also disagrees with Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says that people have rejected Peter. Elijah came, people rejected John the Baptist. Elijah came, John the Baptist, and they rejected him. So the Gospel of Mark presents John the Baptist as Elijah. But in John 1, you have people saying, so are you Elijah? And John the Baptist says, no, I'm not Elijah. Jesus is. So it seems like if the Johannine narrator or evangelist is familiar with Mark, which I think he is, how about this? I think he's heard Mark performed among the churches. I don't think he has a text of Mark, but he's at least heard some edition of Mark being delivered. Now here's another fact, Jacob. We have no knowledge of whether Mark performed orally is the same as what we have in the text of Mark. I might guess that it's probably kind of similar, but we don't know that it's a full Mark. Maybe it's fuller than what we have in text. Okay, or maybe an orator is adding stuff beyond what we have, or maybe he's leaving some stuff out. Nobody knows. But at least we have some familiarity. So the first edition of John might be echoing Mark, but then here's another perspective. At that point, it's just two Gospels, or the first edition, maybe for John's local community in Asia Minor now. Okay, so the traditional view is that when Rome is destroying Jerusalem from 67 to 73, but especially in 70 AD, you have people leaving, they don't want to get killed. And so John the Apostle and a bunch of others go to Asia Minor, to Ephesus. I think that's a pretty good guess. There's no place superior to that. So what you have then is you have, for that local community in Asia Minor, Ephesus, you have John the Apostle or other people or another person telling stories of Jesus for that community. They may be familiar with Mark. They may have heard it performed in Ephesus a few years after Peter has died. And so you have, and here's some other stuff, by the way. And here also is another perspective on that, by the way. Okay. And so if the later material includes chapter 21, and then the 3 verses of the Christ hymn, so not verses 6, 7, and 8, and 15, but verses 1 to 5, 10 or 9 to 14, and then 16 to 18, you have basically 3 verses, 3 stanzas that are of equal length. And I think this reflects, okay, I'm going to push against conservatives here. I don't think that's written by John the Evangelist. I think that's written by John the Elder, who is summarizing what he's heard from John the Evangelist. Okay, because it's very similar to 1 John 1, 1 to 3. What we've seen and heard from the beginning, we claim to be the word of life, Well, that material is very similar to the Christ hymn, which is a response to what the evangelist has been preaching and teaching over all these years. So I think the first edition of John, this answers your earlier question. Sorry to take so long to get to it. So the first edition of John is echoing Mark. Yes, John the Baptist came, not the Messiah. Jesus is, but also he's not Elijah either, because Jesus fulfills Elijah and Moses, by the way. So so echoing Mark, but then kind of pushing back against Mark. Now, also you have chapters 5 and 7 that are together. Bultmann thought that 5 and 7, Jesus is in Jerusalem engaging religious authorities. That is seemed like those two go together. So Bultmann thought that maybe chapters 4 and 6 were together, water of life, bread of life, and then 5 and 7 in Jerusalem debating the healing on the Sabbath. So Bultmann thought there was a disarrangement and then a rearrangement, which gives Bultmann permission to many dozen times moving things around so he can get his, oral tradition, revelation sayings, sources together. Oh, look how the poetry fits if we move this around here. In John 6, he moves things around 10 times in one chapter alone to get Gnostic poetry. I don't think that ever happened in history, okay? He's just trying to figure out things. I think a simpler idea or proposal, what if John 6 is just added later? So what if chapters 5 and 7 are together originally, but then John 6 is added later, and then maybe chapters 15, 16, and 17 are added later on. And so 14:31, let us depart, they get to the garden in 18:1. So that's a way, Jacob, of saying a pretty good guess. And many of my scholar friends say, yeah, if there was later material, it probably is going to include chapter 21, the Christ hymn stuff, the Logos hymn. It's going to include chapter 6 and chapters 15, 16, and 17. Now, here's back to your question. If that's the case, and I'm arguing this in my larger bioptic hypothesis, or John's composition theory, a basic 2-edition theory, it could have been a dozen editions, but at least some early material and some later material. If something like this is the case, this is a fact. The first edition of John, if there was one, has only 5 miracles, not 8. Oh, that's kind of like Matthew. The 5 discourses of Jesus, the 5 books of Moses. Jesus is the teacher of the law, the new law. And so Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah. Well, how about so the first edition of John has 5 miracles, not 8 miracles. Oh yeah, the 5 books of Moses, the 5 miracles of Jesus, or the 5 signs of Jesus. Now here's really interesting. These are the 5 signs that are not in Mark. Whoa, what if John is augmenting Mark because John knows Mark? And how about this? What if John is providing early material before Mark 1? So miracle number 1, the miracle at the wedding feast, and then the miracle in Capernaum from afar. These are signs number 1 and number 2 before Mark 1. Whoa. And Matthew then agrees with that, not explicitly, but he places the healing of afar in Capernaum before the miracles in Mark chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 8. So Matthew agrees or supports or coheres with the healing from afar in Capernaum as being before the miracles in Mark 1. So instead of Bultmann's view that the signs source, or in Fortner's view, the signs gospel, I don't think there was one, had numbers to it, number 1 and number 2, and that's all the numbers that are left. I think John is just saying these are the first 2 miracles before Mark 1. And so John has therefore a fuller ministry of John the Baptist before he was thrown into prison. And so John 3:24, these are things that happened before John was thrown into prison. Mark 1:14, after John was thrown into prison, Jesus came ministering. The writer of John says, no. John the Baptist did a lot of stuff before he was thrown into prison along with Jesus. So I think this is a more historically plausible presentation that Jesus and John the Baptist are ministering alongside each other for months, maybe years, or at least a period of time before John was thrown into prison. So that suggests if John the evangelist knows the Gospel of Mark. He wants to augment Mark chronologically because he thinks Mark is chronologically inadequate. One more thing. John, the Gospel, has 3 Passovers, not just one. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus takes only one trip to Jerusalem, and then they kill him, and we have the temple incident. Well, you have 3 Passovers in the Gospel of John. So Jesus ministers at least 2 or 3 years, or maybe more, but it's not just a one-year ministry. To most scholars, that seems more historically plausible. It also seems really unlikely that an observant Jew like Jesus would go to Jerusalem only one time during his ministry, or that he would minister for only over one Passover. No, it probably took time to get things going and for the resistance to develop. You also have, in the Gospel of Mark, people coming from Jerusalem to hear Jesus, and so that suggests that they've known about him in Jerusalem, even as witnessed in the Gospel of Mark. So just one more point here. You have Jesus in John performing 3 signs in Jerusalem or Bethany. So you have the healing of the lame man in John 5 by the pool of Bethzatha, and then you have the healing of the blind man by the pool of Siloam, and then you have the raising of Lazarus. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus does no healings in the south, only healings and signs in the north. So it seems like if John knows of Mark, John wants to augment Mark geographically as well as chronologically. Now, here's just one more fact. Matthew attests to that. In Matthew 21:14, Matthew says, these are the signs, or the signs that Jesus did in Jerusalem, in the temple area, on the blind people and the lame people. Well, those miracles are only in John. So Jacob, that's another case of interfluential contact. It's not that John is depending on Matthew. Matthew is apparently familiar with either the Gospel of John or with narratives presented only in the Gospel of John. That's why I think that simplistic views, oh yeah, John is finished late, therefore John must be depending on everything else. There was nothing in the Johannine tradition that was known to anybody until the whole thing was finalized after the evangelist's death around 100. I think that's totally fallacious and is bad historiography, even though I do think John was finalized late.
We got a couple more super chats. We'll start with Fish and Natalia. Thank you for your super chat. I have thought that there are 2 gospels in John, a gospel that is Gnostic light and one that is historical. How many women do you think are in John 19:25?
Well, let me address the first question. There's absolutely no evidence of a Gnostic source underlying John. I examined all the evidence. Look at my book on John's Christology. There's no evidence of Gnostic material. So that's just totally wrong. Bauer was wrong. Strauss was wrong. Bultmann was wrong. You do have Gnosticism developing after the Gospel of John. Okay. I've just published, or I've just written a huge paper on John and the wisdom of Solomon. The resurrection motifs, light motifs, eternal life, these are also in Wisdom of Solomon and in Ben Sirach. And so also the Odes of Solomon, that's Jewish material. I think Odes of Solomon are Jewish, and I think they are dependent on John. John is not dependent on Gnostic material. So no, there's no evidence for Gnostic material underlying John. Furthermore, you have the sayings of Jesus connected with dialogue and discussions. And so these things happen, people ask Jesus questions, and it goes off into a monologue out of a dialogue. So unlike the Synoptics, where you have, here's a quotation from Jesus coming out of the blue, you don't have that in John. You have discourses at the Last Supper, but you have explanations or furthering, like the light. I am the light of the world, 8:12, walk in the light, John 9. So you have these references to light and illumination as ways of talking about revelation, I think going back to the historical Jesus, or at least the way that the Johannine evangelist is talking about the revelatory work of God in Christ Jesus And that comes out in the Christ hymn in John 1:9. The light of Christ illumines everyone, at least potentially. And I think that does draw in Greco-Roman sensibilities as well as Jewish sensibilities. I mean, going back to Heraclitus and that kind of a thing. What's the question about John 19, about numbers of women? Right. And so you have at the cross, you have several women at the cross. You have Mary Magdalene, you have the mother of Jesus. And so one of the things that I do believe is that the Gospel of John presents women as apostolic leaders. And so the Samaritan woman is the apostle to the Samaritans, and they believe on the basis of her testimony and because they also meet Jesus. And then in John 20, Mary Magdalene, oh, get this, she's the first person to encounter the risen Lord. And so from a Catholic perspective, if the Church of Jesus Christ includes all who have encountered the risen Christ, then for a period of time, Mary Magdalene was the entire Christian church. Whoa, stick that in your ecclesiology. At the very least, she's the bridge between the resurrected Lord and the apostles. And so she is the apostle to the apostles. Now, how about this? The mother of Jesus opens his ministry and she concludes his ministry at the cross. She's there at the first sign, and she's there also at the cross. And she says to the beloved disciple, behold your mother, and to his mother, behold your son. And he cares for her. Now, Bultmann has a lovely insight here that maybe the beloved disciple, author of the narrative, the evangelist, is entrusted with the mother of Jesus, which is Mother Judaism, as he preserves the gospel for the Hellenistic world. And so the beloved disciple must preserve the Jewishness of the Johannine narrative for the Greco-Roman world, and he does a really good job. Isn't that wonderful? Now, I just love the symbolism of that. But maybe they were people. I mean, maybe we have the beloved disciple caring for the mother of Jesus, and that's also a part of church tradition as well.
Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. Simon and Peter, Thomas, Didymus, are they twins?
There's no suggestion that Didymus is a twin with Peter. He's simply called the twin. But Peter certainly is the brother of Andrew. And so you have that connection that is clear. Now, the relation between Peter and the beloved disciple is also a juxtaposed one. And that's one of the reasons that Raymond Brown, I mean, he's I think, the greatest Johannine scholar in the last century. I think he's the greatest American New Testament scholar in the 20th century. Well, Ray kind of changed his mind in his commentary on John, 2 volumes. He's arguing that John the Apostle is the eyewitness and the beloved disciple. But then he kind of changes his mind in the Community of the Beloved Disciple, which I wrote a new foreword for last year. Ray say, well, it doesn't have to be John the Apostle to be an eyewitness. What if it's maybe John the Elder, who also might have been an eyewitness? And so that's also what Martin Hengel was saying, that maybe, assuming the early death of John, which is totally bogus, but maybe maybe the gospel is written by John the Elder. How about this? What if John the Elder is also an eyewitness? And so you have that kind of a possibility. So so Ray argued that if the narrative of the evangelist is John the Elder or somebody like that, it can still go back to an eyewitness who is not one of the 12, because Peter and the beloved disciple, if they're at odds with each other, that might be a problem if we infer that 2 apostles are in disagreement with each other, or if the Gospel of John is citing the beloved disciple as one of the 12 and pushing down Petrine authority. And so maybe it's written by somebody who's not one of the 12 and criticizing apostolic authority from outside the apostolic band. I disagree entirely. I think that we have two apostles, at least this is plausible, I think, and that the Johannine evangelist and John the Elder, I'm saying these are two different people. Okay, so if John the Elder is the final compiler, he is saying, I'm not the eyewitness, I'm not the evangelist. He's the one who leaned against the breast of Jesus, and he's dead. Jesus never said he wouldn't die. Okay, so if John the Elder is the final compiler or editor, he's also saying, I didn't write this, he did. I'm just trying to preserve his stuff. So that's a problem with seeing John the Elder. I do think he's the finalizer of the narrative, but if he's that, then he also says, I didn't write this, he did this. Now, of course, he might also have been the scribe. He might have been the one who is writing down what the evangelist is preaching and teaching over the years, and that's a possibility as well. Okay, but I think, Jacob, that we have a disagreement between two apostolic leaders, or that we have a presentation of the beloved disciple. He's the special one. Jesus loved him best. He's our community hero, and Peter got it wrong from day one. Then again, in chapter 21, Jesus reinstates Peter. He denied him 3 times around charcoal fire, and he gives him a chance to get it right 3 times, although he gets it right, he gets it wrong a couple of times. and so you have the ambivalent restoration of Peter in John 21, and all things are fine and dandy because we have, Peter's proverbial hour in the woodshed, although he still gets restored. How about this? If Petrine authority is being used by Ignatius of Antioch, who, if this is the city in which the Gospel of Matthew is being finalized, and so in Matthew 16, Jesus gives Peter keys to the kingdom, and he's given authority to judge on earth and in heaven. And if Ignatius of Antioch is saying, hey, the way to deal with church divisions is to appoint one bishop in every church. He will call the shots, okay? And that's the way to deal with church dissension. After all, people are splitting off, and you have tensions with Judaizers and Docetists and with people who are causing division. So let's appoint one hierarchical leader in every church. This is around 90 or 100 or so. This is happening in church history. So if he's citing Petrine authority as a way to bolster church hierarchy in the name of Peter and therefore the 12, what if somebody like Diotrephes in 3 John claims primacy, claims to be first? Diotrephes, the philoproteron, the primacy lover, in 3 John verses 9 and 10, he's excluding John's Christians from his church. And if any take them in and show them hospitality, he kicks them out of his own church. So the elder says, I've written to the church about Diotrephes, and I'm going to talk to him directly when I talk to him. So he's citing Matthew 18, confront somebody, personally, also bring him before the church. So if we have at least one hierarchical leader who is abusing Petrine authority, maybe we have the elder publishing and circulating the Gospel of John as a deconstruction of Petrine hierarchical authority in the name of a more primitive memory of Jesus. And by the way, pushing back against house codes and appointing male leaders in your churches, remember, we have apostolic women in the ministry of Jesus. So I'm seeing the Gospel of John as reflecting an alternative perspective among the apostles that challenges apostolic hierarchy in the name of a more primitive memory of Jesus and his view for the church.
Fishner Ty, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Charles Worth's theory that Thomas is a beloved disciple?
Yeah. Jim's book is probably the most expansive work on the beloved disciple. Alan Culpepper's book on John the son of Zebedee is the fullest presentation of second and third century memory. I like Jim's work. I think it's flawed, though, on this way. And Jim's a good friend of mine. But uh, Thomas had not yet believed in the last in John 20:25 to 29. In the first 10 verses, the beloved disciple looks and sees and believes. So if Thomas had not yet believed, but verses 1 to 10 say the beloved disciple believed, that makes it impossible to assume that Thomas is the beloved disciple. Yeah. Also, can I just mention another fact?
Sure.
Okay, so just because you find a problem with something in the text, or a problem with one particular person being the beloved disciple, like John the Apostle, what's the evidence for the alternative? So, so if the beloved disciple is accompanying Peter, as the Johannine narrative suggests, who else accompanies Peter in gospel narratives? Thomas doesn't. Lazarus doesn't. I'd love to see Mary Magdalene be the beloved disciple, but she is not presented as accompanying Peter anywhere. And furthermore, in chapter 21, the beloved disciple points out to Peter, look, we have seen the Messiah in the lake. And so Peter, who is naked, throws on his clothes. Well, how could Mary Magdalene, or Mary, sister of Lazarus, be in the boat with Peter, who is naked? I mean, I'd love to know that the beloved disciple is a woman. I love that idea, but the facts just go against it, and I think critically, it's a flawed view.
Can you tell us a bit about the revealer in Acts and John?
Yeah, and so the divine initiative happens in John and in the New Testament and in the book of Acts. And so you have the saving initiative of God as happening in many different ways. And so part of the question is, how do people respond to the divine initiative? And this is a way that I think that the Gospel of John is universalistic in ways that it shows the light enlightens everyone. This is the light that has come into the world, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so the question is whether people will respond to the divine initiative. Now, John 6:64 and 6, sorry, John 6:44 and 45, no one can come except being drawn by the Father. As is written in Isaiah 54:13, all will be taught by God. And so the issue is the divine initiative. Any who believed in him, they become children of God. He came to his own received him not, but as many as believed, or as being receptive to the divine initiative, not of something of human plans or man's will, but born of the divine initiative. I think that opens up the universality of John so that any who respond to the light, whether they know the story of Jesus or not, if they're responding to the divine initiative, then they can be reached by the eternal Christ, according to John's universalism. Now, that's going to be pushed back against by John 14, verses 6 and 7. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by Jesus. Well, is that a way of saying, sorry, wrong answer, hell for you? Or is that of saying the way that God has acted in history in a climactic way is through Jesus, who is the way and the truth and the life? And so that corresponds then with the divine initiative. Although people don't need to know a particular story happening in Jesus of Nazareth to also respond to the light, and they may do that even if they haven't heard the Christian story. The issue is a response to the divine initiative, or in Pauline terms, Abraham believed God, to him was credited as righteousness. And so I think you have John showing that response to what God has done and is doing as being connected to God's grace, and that's represented eschatologically in the Christ events and the ministry of Jesus, but it also continues before and after that in terms of the divine initiative.
Does the book of Acts have a lot in common with John's gospel?
Yeah, and again, I've just written an essay on this, and Jacob, feel free to post my reference to that on my academia page, if you'd like to. um,
Yeah, well,
um, since J. Lewis Martin, 1968, a history and theology in the Gospel of John, Lou argues that we don't have really the evangelist doing history. We have a science source, or we have a science gospel. Lou Martin was his doctoral student. So there we have the narrative. And then we have the theology that is the evangelist. So history, a science gospel, and then the evangelist is adding theology in his construction of the words of Jesus. And the big issue, according to Martin and Fortna, is you have tensions with Jewish leaders in Asia Minor or elsewhere from 70 to 100. And so Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and he's pushing back against Jewish leaders. And so he's putting words into the mouth of Jesus in the narrative by saying Jesus is the Messiah, pushing back against those who are accusing Johannine believers of monotheism or of ditheism, and saying, no, just really is sent by God. Well, in the book of Acts, you also have Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and Saul, before he becomes Paul, or before he encounters Christ on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, you have people killing Stephen. You have Saul putting Christians in jail, or followers of Jesus in jail. And so you have opposition to the Jesus movement and the way all through the book of Acts, even into Acts chapter 19 and 20 and 21, where they want to kill Saul, they want to kill Paul, and they even make a vow to kill him. And fortunately, he's rescued by the Romans. How's that for ironies? So when you look at opposition to the revealer in Acts, is also echoed by opposition to the revealer in the Gospel of John. And so the Judaioi, it's not the Jews, it's the Judeans, it's the religious elite in Jerusalem. These are people who are threatened by the divine initiative or by the revealer because they are the establishment. And so John's gospel is not anti-Jewish. It is pro-Jewish in a radical kind of way. It's saying Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah, he fulfills the prophet like Moses typology of Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 22. His words come true. Therefore, he's the one whom Moses predicted. And if you respond to the Son, you also respond to the Father. If you reject the Son, you're rejecting the Father. Now, that's also similar to Mark chapter 12, where you have the managers of the vineyard who they don't pay their dues, and finally they kill the vineyard owner's son. So again, you have corroborative impression between one of the parables in Mark and also Jesus as son of the Father in the Gospel of John. So point being that what you have echoed in Acts, independently of John, shows that the Gospel of John is not anti-Jewish. Rather, Judaioi is a way of talking about the people in the South, whereas John's Jesus fulfills the typologies of Israel in the I am sayings. He is the King of Israel. He is the vine, like Isaiah chapter 5, the vineyard. Well, Jesus is the vine. He is the shepherd of the sheep, just like Israel's leaders are shepherds of the flock. And so, and in John 4, salvation is of the Jews. And the irony is that Samaritans get it right, but some of the leaders in Jerusalem don't get it right. Although a lot of people in Jerusalem are believing in Jesus, so not everybody rejects Jesus, but they get pressured by the religious elite to tamp down their belief in Jesus, even though they're really impressed by him. So we have corroborative impression between Acts and John in resistance to the Jesus movement that happens during his ministry and also after that. And so I think that corroborates John's historicity as opposed to reading it as being anti-Jewish. I think John is pro-Jewish, and so John is arguing for the heart of Judaism, like Paul's letters are arguing for the boundaries of Judaism.
We have another super chat question from iFish No Tie. Thank you for your super chat. I did a family tree of the Jameses. I had an epiphany after reading Tertullian. I now think Joseph Clopas, I now think Joseph equals Clopas equals Alpheus. It simplifies everything. Thoughts?
Okay, all right. Good thinking there. And feel free to send me some of your work, and I'll be glad to look at that.
And for my final question, um, when you look at the Papias tradition, what does it say about the authorship of Luke and John?
Not so much about Luke, but here, and I presented a paper on this at the Vatican at the Lateran 12 years ago, 13 years ago, 2013. I guess that's 12 years ago. You have Papias quoted in Eusebius, Church History 339. Papias is citing the elder about 3 critiques of Mark. And this is a fact. He's citing John the Elder. So these are 3 Johannine opinions. Whether they're right or wrong, who knows? But these are cited as Johannine opinions that Mark is pretty good, but not exactly correct. And when you look at these 3 items, they're exactly represented in John's differences with Mark. Number 1, Mark represents a digest of the preachings of Peter, and Mark's pretty good, but it's in the wrong order. So Mark represents Peter's preaching, but it's in the wrong order. So the temple incident in John, putting it early, is not for theological reasons. He puts it early for historical, chronological reasons, as well as to and from Jerusalem. That's more chronological. And the Last Supper was the day before the Passover, not a Passover meal. Mark puts it as a Passover meal for Eucharistic reasons, for liturgical reasons. No, this is the day before the Passover. And even in Mark, Jesus is crucified the day before the Passover, even though he presents it as a Passover meal. Okay, so I think that John's alternative chronology is a knowing difference, trying to correct Mark chronologically, and I do think it's more accurate. And Matthew and Luke follow Mark, but just because they don't know any better. How about this? An early temple incident also sees this as a prophetic sign, an inaugural prophetic sign, like the work of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is challenging Roman soldiers, he's challenging Herod, he's challenging the aristocracy in the name of justice. And so Jesus, alongside the ministry of John the Baptist, before John is thrown into prison, is presented as doing a temple cleansing to challenge the temple alongside John the Baptist. And already at the end of John chapter 4 and in John chapter 5, the people had seen his signs done in Jerusalem, and already they want to kill him when he does his first healing in Jerusalem. Why? Because they were offended at the temple incident that had already happened before his second visit to Jerusalem. So I think that John's chronology is knowing, and I think it's more accurate, and that's what Papias quotes being said by John the Elder, reflecting a first century Johannine opinion. Critique number 2. Mark is pretty good, but it's not really historical because the sayings are clumped together instead of being contextually engaged in what's happening in the narrative. So when you look at quotations of Jesus in the Synoptics, it's true in Mark, it's true in Q, it's also true in Matthew, it's also true in Luke. In all 4 of these traditions, if there were 4, you have collections of sayings. Here's a parable, here's another parable, here's another parable, here's another one. Here's 1 saying, 1, 2 saying, 3 saying, 4 saying. They're presented as sayings clumped together. In John, Jesus does something, people ask questions, and then he says this and that. They question him further, and then he goes into a discourse. So in John, the sayings of Jesus are rooted in dialogues and in confusion among the discussants. the Johannine elder says that is history. Mark is not history. The synoptics are not history. Well, in this case, Mark is not history. It's a collection of sayings coming out of a basket, like a basket of sayings and this and that. That's not really history. Okay. But, he's doing that. Mark is preparing it for his audiences. So I'm just publishing right now. This will come out in a year and a half from now in John Jesus History, Volume 6, John among the Synoptics, or just remembered among the Gospels. And several of our authors picked up on this exactly, that Mark's story represents the way preachers tell the stories about Jesus, clumping stuff together, whereas John's history of Jesus, or story of Jesus, reflects historical memory about place and time and person and context and this and that. And this is why that happened. And those little details are not expanded upon theologically. Not saying, well, therefore, little boys should give their lunch. Isn't that nice? No. Andrew, Philip, where are we going to find some food? And Philip comes up with, or Andrew comes up with, hey, here's a kid. He's got some stuff. Okay, and so things are not symbolized or theologized in the details. Now, the sayings of Jesus are, but you have more historical memory represented in the way the sayings are connected with dialogues and discussions and misunderstandings. And with Mikhail Bakhtin, anytime you have misunderstanding in narrative, it is always rhetorical. So stupidity in narrative is always rhetorical. So the sayings of Jesus and John, the discourses, are challenges to misunderstandings in the narrative. Goodness, maybe that even goes back to historical misunderstandings. Point number 3. Therefore, now here is an affirming of Mark's problems, even though he thinks they are not historical. So the Johannine elder says, Mark has some duplications. He's got some healings that are kind of the same. Oh, he's got 2 feedings. Okay. Now, historically, if there was a feeding, I think there was only one. When you look at the feeding in Mark 6 and in Mark 8, you have 17 common elements. I don't think that 17 common elements are stacked up back to back as the same kind of event. That seems totally unlikely. What is more likely is that you have the feeding of the 5,000 that is remembered as it circulated among the churches. And when the story is told among the Gentile churches, you have 7 baskets picked up. Why? Because 7 deacons in Acts chapter 6. And these are 7 deacons that are Greek, not Jewish. So as the story is told among the deacons or among the Greek churches, the Hellenistic churches, not 12 apostles, 7 deacons, thank you very much. And how about this? You even have 2 loaves and 5 fishes. Now you have 7 loaves. And so even the numbers get conflated. And 4,000, well, you have the Egyptian wanting to take 4,000 people and march up into Jerusalem. And that suggests that the event is remembered like a Passover revolution. And so in Mark 6, you have sitting them down in companies of 100 and of 50, and that's just the men, soldiers that are counted in Matthew. So you have echoes of a revolt in the desert, like a revolution. We're going to march to Jerusalem and overthrow the Romans, 5,000 soldiers, and Jesus gives us rations like the wilderness, like Moses did. Go team, go. We're going to kill the Romans. And Jesus says, no, the Son of Man must suffer and die. Or you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. You have to be willing to suffer and die with Jesus. That is the main thing. And so people abandon him and walk with him no longer. And he says to the 12, are you going to abandon me also? And Peter says, wait, what are we going to do? Okay, so I think that you have a Johannine critique of duplications in Mark. That's why, Jacob, the first edition of John does not duplicate Mark, because the Johannine creative story of Jesus doesn't want to duplicate Mark. And so it's critical of Mark's duplications. That's a way of saying there was really only one feeding, not 2. And so the first edition of John has 5 miracles that aren't in Mark, 2 miracles that are early and 3 miracles that are southern. Okay, 5 books of Moses, 5 signs of Jesus. So John augments Mark chronologically. But here's how then the elder makes an excuse for Mark. Mark made no mistake in including the extra stuff or the duplications. He was just conservative. He didn't want to leave out anything that he had heard as he's gathering the stories of Jesus. So those are three critiques of Mark and compliments of Mark coming from John the Elder that cohere exactly with why John is different from Mark. Number one, Mark's chronology is wrong. Here's a new chronology. Number two, Jesus' sayings are rooted in dialogues and engagements and people's challenges to him. They're not just collections of sayings in a katina or a form critical basket. Number three, duplications are a problem. That's why we're not duplicating Mark. Thank you very much. But you got Mark's story. Here's our story that augments Mark. It's different from day one. And we tried not to duplicate Mark. But in the final edition, okay, we'll give you the feeding of the 5,000. But by the way, this is the most complete version of everything that happened. And it kind of replaces what you have there in Mark 6 and Mark 8.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody about the links to purchase Paul Anderson's books will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And this includes the link to view his latest article, Authentic Worship in John and Luke Acts, Influence, Interfluence, and Resonance on his Academia EDU page. So again, that link to that will be in the description and the pinned comment as well. With that being said, Paul, thank you for joining me tonight.
Hey, thank you, Jacob. Great being with you, and hope to see you at the Boston meetings next week.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.